Good evening. Welcome to special lecture by Dr. Divya Vaid, Madam from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. On behalf of RC8, that is Stratification, Inequalities and Exclusion Studies, this is Convener Dr. Sreemannarayana Murthy, along with our Co-Convener Supriya Singh. Extend a warm welcome to you, Madam Dr. Divya Vaidji, to deliver a special lecture on uneven chances, gender aspirations, and social mobility. Well, my dear colleagues of RC8 and other guests, may I inform you that Madam is a very reputed academic who pursued her studies in Oxford, London, and also University of Yale, USA. And may I now request our co-convener, Dr. Supriya Singh from Lucknow University, to introduce Madam to our RC8 members and other guests. Over to you, Dr. Supriya Singh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Divya Vaid. She is an associate professor of sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has held postdoctoral positions at the Department of Social.
And it is studied through factors such as the location in a particular community. However, for the purpose of, especially in terms of the broader data analysis, it was seen to be more useful to have an individual level approach for the women that I was studying. Further, the other terms that come up with regard to social mobility are usually absolute and relative mobility. So we know that absolute mobility is the mobility in raw numbers. So it's the total percent of people who are moving up or down or horizontally. And relative mobility, on the other hand, does something more important, which is that while absolute mobility is significant for establishing the patterns of mobility in a society, relative mobility allows us to capture what mobility is taking place net of structural change, which means, for instance, if agriculture is declining in size, manufacturing is increasing in size, or services are increasing in size, we will naturally see some social mobility because of the way that the class scheme is positioned. However, relative mobility allows us to see what change is taking place while keeping structural change constant. And usually within bigger quantitative approaches to social mobility, relative mobility is a preferred indicator of social mobility. Now, within the Indian context, while there is some work on social mobility, particularly at the macro level, the research on women's mobility is actually very limited, particularly within sociology. So a lot of economists study income or wealth mobility, they tend to focus more on men. Very few people do macro level studies of social mobility of women. And we know that opportunities of mobility are influenced by factors such as gender, by family background, location, educational opportunities, government policies, etc. And so the context in which social mobility is taking place needs to be fairly clear. Now, there are various approaches to social mobility, and I think we are more familiar with the qualitative approaches in terms of the ethnographic studies on social mobility, for instance, the work of Osella and Osella in Kerala, or the life history approach, which is the work of Veronique Benet in Maharashtra. But we do also have quantitative approaches for the study of social mobility. The kinds of questions the qualitative approaches and the quantitative approaches ask are very different. So within the quantitative approaches, economists, as I mentioned, tend to focus much more on income or wealth mobility, and sociologists focus much more on occupational-based approaches to social mobility. There is less work, but there is work on education-based approaches to social mobility. Within sociology, though, there is a division between a more status attainment-based approach, which comes from Blau and Duncan in America, and can be traced to them from their paper in the 1960s, as well as, in contrast, a more class-based approach to social mobility, which comes more from the British sociology tradition. Perfect. Now, in addition to these qualitative and quantitative approaches, there's of course the possibility of a mixed method approach. This is potentially the least used within social mobility research in India. And hardly any work exists which brings together the qualitative and the quantitative. And today I'll try and show you in the limited time we have about one attempt that I have made to bring the macro and the micro together within a mixed method approach. Now, so today's focus, I'm interested in not just the broader patterns of social mobility, but I will talk about them. So I'll start by discussing what those patterns of mobility are. And as I said, there's very little work on gender generally, very little work on women, even though workforce participation rates of women are fairly low. So the expectation is that they experience mobility in a very different way than men might experience. And there is also, of course, literature like Gierdinev's work in Tirupur, which shows that there is a withdrawal of women from the labor force, especially when there's an increase in status of the family. Further, education, as we know, is seen to have an impact on social mobility, and I'll discuss that in a moment, which might be mediated by social location. So within this context, I'm particularly interested in focusing on the urban. And as the talk goes, you'll see why I'm focusing on the urban for my research. And the urban particularly is quite distinct in terms of not just patterns of mobilities, but opportunities that might be available and the experiences and aspirations people might have. However, we know the urban is not homogeneous. We know there's a lot of variation within what constitutes the urban. And so I focus much more on Delhi so that there is a site on which I can focus as a site of opportunity and constraint. There are several questions that I will cover over the duration of the talk, some in more detail, some slightly less because of time. But essentially, I'm looking at what are the patterns of social mobility, how are they patterned, and what are the drivers of mobility. I'm in particular interested in education as a possible driver of social mobility. And then how people experience, especially women experience mobility, and what motivates one to achieve within the labor market. And I'm talking particularly in the context of the labor market. So theoretically, I'm positioning myself within what is traditionally called the OED triad, which is the origin, education, destination triad within mobility research. So essentially, we have the class of origin, usually traditionally seen as the class of origin, and the class of destination. And the expectation is that in societies where the link between origins and destinations is very strong, those are societies where you see much less social mobility, because most of what one achieves, which is one's destination, the job or the occupational class that one is positioned is influenced very strongly by the origins. However, there is an expectation that education mediates the association between origins and destinations. So education is the possible avenue to social mobility. Education helps people to achieve destinations distinct from what they were born into. However, education itself is not value neutral. Education is influenced by origin. So the kinds of education one has access to might be influenced by origins. And this is the traditional OED triad as it's done globally, but within the Indian context, and I won't be able to talk in today's talk on caste because that involves a separate detailed discussion, but I'm interested specifically at how caste also influences destination, caste influences education, and the association between class of origin and caste itself. So my broader work lies in this bigger area, but today I'm focusing much more on the OED triad. Now, in terms of stages of research, and since I'm positioning this as a possible mixed method strategy, I began my research in the first stage by looking at national level and urban patterns of social mobility by gender. And I'll talk today from the National Election Survey data. Particularly, this data covers the period 1996 to 2014. Unfortunately, the data from 2019 and after can't be used for this analysis because there's no information on parents' occupation, because we need to study intergenerational mobility. That data is missing. In the second stage of analysis, I focus much more. So from the national, I moved to the more Delhi-based study, which is a survey that I did along with CSDS on education and social mobility. And then in the third stage, I move on to more in-depth interviews with young working women. across a range of occupations, both in the formal and the informal sector. So I moved from the macro to the much more micro. And in the final stage, I've been working on a more case study. So looking at some women longitudinally over nearly a decade following and interviewing them over time. So as with any study on social mobility, one needs to define the strata within which mobility is being studied. And for me, I'm looking at a class-based mobility scheme. And so these classes, and I don't think there's time for me to discuss where they arrive, but there's a full discussion on this in my book. I'm happy to have a discussion in the Q&A. But this is a class classification based on about 100 occupations within the National Elections Survey data. And out of those 100, using tests of predictive validity, I was able to narrow down following some standard mobility schemes like the Casman or the Kumar et al. Scheme, and to expand it to the Indian context by looking at some categories like professionals or business or farming and manual, and the divisions among them. And so these are the categories between which I'm talking about in terms of social mobility. Now, this is not a strictly hierarchical scheme, because there might be some people who are positioned in large business and they move to high professional classes that would be seen as more horizontal rather than upward movement. So that is kept in mind when mobility percentages are calculated. So to start with, what are the first question I'm asking are about patterns of occupational change, essentially how much mobility there is, and has it changed over time? To do this, I do several stages of analysis. The first, I go through descriptives, which I'll just do in the next slides, which talk about intergenerational change. I then move on to talking about absolute mobility, which are in terms of mobility tables and summarizing those. And finally, I'll talk about relative mobility using odds ratios and log linear modeling, how we can separate and look at relative rates of mobility. So to start with, it's useful to have a description of what the field looks like. And so this data is, as I said, from the National Election Survey. This is from 2004 to 14. In this data, what we have, and this is for men, and I'll move to the women's slide in a moment. What you have is, this is change in occupational distribution of men as compared to their fathers. So what we have over here, anything around below 0 means there's a decline over one generation in that particular social class. Any bar above 0 means that there has been an increase over a generation in that particular class. So we can see that a much sharper decline across the survey years is taking place in farm, both small farm ownership, large farm ownership, and those in low agriculture. So these are the areas for men where there is a decline as compared to their fathers. Now, I should say that usually when we compare, it's men to their fathers, but also women to their fathers rather than women to the mothers. And the reason in the literature, the argument is because there are much fewer mothers in a generation who might be in employment. And that was definitely the case within the Indian data. So I will mainly right now be talking about women as compared to their fathers. But in my book, I also do women as compared to their mothers for whatever data is available. So when we now switch over to women, we see that the graph's very different. We see that while there is a decline amongst the low agriculture and in terms of farm ownership, there were much fewer women. But in terms of low agriculture, women are not leaving low agriculture as much as men are. And we see a much sharper increase for women as compared to their fathers in low professional classes. So women tend to be I'm sorry, is my PowerPoint not visible? Can you please tell me?
Yes, yes, it is.
All right. Okay, thank you. Okay, because there was a message that said it's not visible. All right, so we see that women, there is a very different pattern within the labor market of women as compared to men. That's what these first two slides are showing us. In the third slide, I'm now looking at a cross classification and looking at patterns of social mobility themselves. These are percentages. And the way we read this is that we see so these are figures from 96 to 2014. For 2009 and 14, I'm able to disaggregate it by rural urban. For previous years, that's not possible in the data. And we have separately for men and for women. And what we're seeing is that while India clearly has a much higher proportion of stability, which is absence of mobility for both women and men. The figures are actually higher for women than they are for men. This is very different from global patterns of social mobility. So we're seeing women in India experience much more intergenerational stability than men do. We are also able to disaggregate the mobility into upward, downward, and horizontal. And we notice, and the last column here is the division of upward over downward. So this shows us that all of these figures are in the positive. So actually for both women and men, there is more upward rather than downward mobility, but the proportions are lower for women than for men. So men experience more upward mobility than women do. However, what really stands out is what's happening in urban India. When we look at both 2009 and 2014, we notice that, of course, at the aggregate, we see a certain level of stability. But when we disaggregate to the urban, we see that women in urban India, especially in 2014, experience much more social mobility than men do. Their stability is lower. So they experience much more social mobility than men do. And they seem to experience much more downward than upward mobility as compared to men. And these are urban women. So keeping this in mind, it informs some of the rest of my research, which is on the specific nature of urban India, and especially the influence this has on women's opportunities within the labor market. Um, I then map this over birth cohorts. So one is able to look at birth cohorts from the same data, the 2014 data, going back to those born in the 1950s. And we see that there is some pattern in terms of the decline of stability and an increase in social mobility, but it reverses itself in the 2014 data. And because we don't have data after 2014, we're not really able to see whether this reversal is a permanent reversal or whether it's a blimp in the patterns. As Goldthorpe and all studied for the British case, sometimes these patterns are in a constant flux. And we are not able to test that because of the absence of data past 2014. Moving on from those absolute numbers, so that is the proportions that are upwardly or downwardly mobile. I was interested in looking at what the odds ratios are, so the relative rates of mobility. Now here, in given that my class schema has 11 occupations, there are possibly 100 odds ratios. So 11 minus 1 squared. And so there are approximately 100 odds ratios, but I'm only showing a few of them just to give a sense of what the data shows. What do these odds ratios mean? These are symmetrical odds ratios. Essentially, they mean that those who are born in low agricultural class have the opportunity to move to farm ownership as compared to those who are born in farm ownership remaining in farm ownership. And what we find are the proportions are so high. So the chances of someone born in farm ownership retaining it as compared to a low agriculturalist making it are 237 times 1. And for women, it's 273 times 1. So the barrier to mobility is very strong. To move from not owning land, which are low agriculturalists, to owning land even if you're a small farmer. Similarly, the movement between business and high professionals is also very sticky. This is called stickiness, and it's particularly sticky for women. It's very difficult for women who are in large business to move up to professional classes, and between business as well. So from petty business to large business ownership, the movement is difficult. What seems to be the lowest odds ratios, which are the more equal chances. So the perfect odds ratio would be a 1-to-1, where anyone has the opportunity to have any job. Here we can see that the numbers are actually very high. We find that men moving from low to high professional, 15 times 1 chance. And for women, it's about doubled, but it's still better than in other occupations. So moving within the professions is slightly easier in terms of social mobility opportunities. Now, because this is as I said, there are 100 of this that can be calculated. What we do is we calculate what's called the log linear model. So we construct a log linear model, and I won't go too much into the detail, but I'll say that essentially the log linear model that seems to fit the data best is the UNIDIF model, which is essentially showing us that there is a uniform difference in terms of gender. But there is a weakening between origins and destination, and we see them for both men and for women. So that is the broader. And so I summarized it here by saying that from the first part of the study, what one finds is that India is highly intergenerationally stable, particularly for women. Though there is the same direction of movement, it is an opening economy. So there is more upward over downward mobility across gender. However, women seem to be concentrated in certain occupations, and we are seeing them in lower levels of agriculture, so skilled work, non-skilled work, and non-agricultural employment. So we also see women who are engaged in low professions much more than men are. And in terms of relative rates, we see, especially, and I haven't shown all the tables to summarize it, essentially what we find is that the origin-destination association is weaker in urban India, which means there's more mobility in relative rates as well as absolute rates. And this is weaker for women. So women are much more mobile in urban areas. That leads me then to ask a question about what the mechanisms of mobility are. So what role does education play in all of this, and how do these patterns of mobility vary by education, and whether merit makes a difference or not? So are those with higher education more likely to experience higher social mobility? Very simply, this is just just a regular distribution crosstab of location and degree. And what we find is the urban is very distinct, because those with college graduation, urban men, 29% of the sample have college degrees, and urban women also 29% of the sample. So we're saying that women in urban India, as compared, if we were looking at rural India, where there's much more inequality, in urban India, in terms of degrees at least, there seems to be a little bit more parity. And then the question arises whether that influences what happens in the labor market. And the modernization thesis essentially posited that if with an increase in modernization of a society, with an increase in education, one would see the OD association, which is the social mobility, the inheritance of criteria declining, and achievement would play a bigger role. So origins would decline, and education would start to be seen as much more important. And so to query whether that is in fact the case, I picked only the professional occupations where the expectation is that there would be an impact on education has an impact on getting access to the professions. Unlike, for instance, in farming, where education might not be the most important criteria and where inheritance might be a bigger criteria. So for the next set of analysis, I only look at access to professional occupations, and I'm asking the question about whether education makes a role, whether achievement really matters. And I do it by running a logistic regression models across birth cohorts, in which the outcome, the dependent variable, is professional occupation, the professional class. And I'm looking at the independent variables are essentially class of origin, which is father's class, caste, and education. So the level of education of the respondent. And I do it separately for women and men. I'm getting some noise. I think someone's mic is on, and it's I'm getting this kind of noise. Is that just me? Yeah, sorry. All right. So to summarize a more complicated models run, I'll show you two tables, one for men and one for women, where the outcome is access to professional classes. And this is over birth cohorts, which means these are those born in the 1950s, those born in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which are the youngest in the data. And what we have are the independent variables, which are father's class. Caste has all the categories. Over here, I'm only showing two to summarize the table, because the others are statistically non-significant. But caste, there are 100 categories of jati in the data, and education, where we have different levels of education. The red figures, which are with the negative and star sign, are statistically significant, but they show that there's a negative effect of that independent variable on getting access to the profession. And the black figures with a plus sign show a positive effect of gaining access to the profession. So what we find is controlling for caste and for education, those who come from professional classes themselves, so their class of origin is profession, across the birth cohorts have a positive chance of gaining access to the professions themselves. whereas those who come from manual and low agricultural work and somewhat farming for the youngest cohort, it has a negative effect on them gaining access to professions. In terms of caste, we see that this is not a consistent effect across both cohort. In terms of education, the two that stand out for men are that men require at least intermediate education to gain access to the professions. And this seems to be, if they have intermediate education, it's a positive, controlling for class and for caste. Those who come from rural areas have a negative chance of gaining access to the professions. Now, this is for men. As soon as I switch to women, we see that the pattern is quite distinct. We see that while coming from a professional class, it has a consistent positive effect. The caste effects change. And more interestingly, women seem to have a higher threshold they need to meet to gain access to the profession. So consistently, they need at least college education. Whereas for men, intermediate education is also sufficient to gain access to the professions. For women, at least college education is required to gain access to those professions. So this shows us that class has a consistent impact on individual stances. So class of origins, that hasn't gone away. So modernization said class of origin would matter less. That has clearly not happened. Class of origin is still important in gaining access to professions. And education, especially in urban India, and when I disaggregate by rural urban, shows a consistent impact for women especially, but it's not leading to a replacement of ascription by achievement. Whereas achievement matters, ascription still seems to clearly matter to an extent. And the urban is clearly an important site of mobility, which leads me then to ask, what are these patterns of social mobility by education in rural and urban? And this table has too much going on, but essentially let me summarize that these are by levels of education for women and men. And what we see is those with college education have much higher social mobility than those with lower levels of education. So with each level of education, the social mobility actually increases. So education clearly plays a role. Where it's playing a role is probably in not just in the professions, but in other access to other occupations as well. And clearly it makes a difference to women who have college education. And these are in absolute terms. When we look in relative terms, these are the outcome of the UNIDIF model. Essentially what this is showing, I'm trying to graph anything that's at one, at the level one. This means that there is the OD association is consistent, whereas anything more than one shows a stronger OD association, and anything less than one would show a weaker OD association. What we find is those with college education, which are the first bars for both women and men, have their OD association is weaker than for those with lower levels of education. So in both absolute terms and in relative terms, education clearly matters in terms of social mobility, and it particularly matters for women because those who are towards the lower end of education are much less socially mobile. So education is clearly making a difference. So if we read these results along with the previous analysis, we see that education is clearly of significance to macro patterns of mobility. College education, especially for women, is a marker of mobility opportunities. And this underlines the significance of studying, in my mind, studying women, and especially those in urban areas. This is the broader national patterns. After this, I move on to the more Delhi specific, and this is very briefly. The study that I did was actually in Delhi and Patna, but because my qualitative work is more focused right now on Delhi, I'm only summarizing the Delhi data. We again see that urban is clearly a site of social mobility, especially in absolute mobility terms. This is my second stage when I was able to look at the social mobility patterns of women and men in both Delhi and Patna. And that led me then to my third and my fourth stage, which is the more qualitative stage. So I started with the quantitative. I started by doing a kind of a systematic analysis of national and local, so city level patterns in Delhi. And then I move on to the interviews. And so in the third and fourth stage, I'm interested in people's experiences. So once we've established that there is a pattern, once we've seen that the pattern is potentially distinct for urban women, I'm interested in how they negotiate work and aspirations. So I did this by in-depth interviews with young working women from a range of occupations, and I got varied responses on the experience of mobility. And very interestingly, what they saw as the role of the city as a site of mobility. So for instance, those women who were migrant to Delhi, because I had both migrants and non-migrants, the migrants to Delhi spoke very highly of the advantage of being in Delhi as a possibility for them to be socially mobile. Very interestingly, there were women who said, the city is liberating. The city provides us everybody in Delhi works. And when I discuss with them that actually the official labor force participation rates are really low in Delhi, those are the official figures. But for people's experience, they feel that the city is liberating. The city is potentially a site where work is possible and a range of work is possible. When I had discussions on the value that they placed on education and whether they placed, a certain kind of value on education, or did education play a role in their, transitions, there was a clear distinction. So there were those who said that education, knowledge, and skills were seen as essential to life for survival. Was seen as essential for life for survival, especially those who were in the lower socioeconomic strata were more likely to say that education, minimum education. So they use the word rather than education or schooling. Some of the respondents said things like jankari, which is information. So knowing how to negotiate a city is made possible through being literate enough to be able to negotiate which buses to take, how to go to the bank, and they had a lot of discussion on how this was a crucial skill for them. However, those who were higher up in the socioeconomic scale, who had the basic level of education, for them, education was not really seen as a mode of survival. Education was then seen as a possibility to opportunities. And importantly, I remember there was one person who said that since she had college education, she felt that now it wasn't education itself, but it was English language education, which was more crucial for the kinds of opportunities she was looking at. So so we can't really treat all women as homogeneous, depending on the socioeconomic position, their own social class location, education itself had played different roles. Interestingly, the idea of regret was something that came up in the interviews quite a bit. The regret, especially amongst those who had low levels of education, in the sense that they felt that they should have had higher education, because now that they see those around them get more and more opportunities and chances to be mobile, they feel that absence of education for them meant that they lost out on those chances. Further, what struck me as an interesting thing, which I've pursued in one of my papers, is the idea of guilt. Guilt as a potential motivator, guilt and failure. And I'm interested in both guilt and failure. So one could see, in terms of especially the literature on aspirations, that failure could could have two outcomes. One could either fail and then just stop trying, and so not even attempt to aspire, or what could fail and then work harder to aspire more. And particularly in one of my case studies, which has gone on for about 8 years, in that study, it was seen that failure was actually a motivator for that person that I was focusing on, because she was someone who was self-employed. She was doing very well at the first set of interviews that I did about a decade ago. She had set up her own business. She was in a very male-dominated field. She was on an up. She was being talked about in newspaper articles, etc. However, in the period from my first interview to the next time that I spoke to her, the business kind of failed. It started to fail, and she spoke about how she didn't have networks. She didn't have the networks a lot of the male colleagues she had, partners she knew had, and so she had to retrain herself. She had to kind of go through several downs before she could go on and up, and she had to change her career trajectory. So this idea of intra-generational mobility became important, because she saw each opportunity, each new job as a possibility to better what she'd done before. And she spoke very much about how failure was a motivator for her. So failing was something that really drove her to move ahead. And through these interviews, some questions have arisen in my mind about how does one look at ambition? How does one look at dissatisfaction in the larger field of aspirations? We know there is research on aspirations. In India, that research tends to be much more male focused. So you have, for instance, Craig Jeffrey's work. You have much less work on women's aspirations. But how does ambition and dissatisfaction position itself within this aspiration literature? And if we want to study the barriers and risks young women face in the labor market, the risk of losing a job, the risk of being downwardly mobile, and these can vary. These kinds of risks vary very much by occupation, by socioeconomic status, and by level of education. So the kinds of risks people are willing to take vary by whether they have a safety net below them or not. And so this person that I mentioned, the entrepreneur, felt she could take a few risks. So even though her family is not a business family, she was financially stable enough that she could take the risk to retrain and set up something else. So I focus specifically on aspirations in terms of both education and the labor market, and the role they expected to play with social mobility. And as seen in those macro patterns, national patterns, there is much more opportunity for women in urban India. But through the interviews, I gather there is greater precariousness as well. So not only in terms of macro figures that they are downwardly mobile, this is matched by the interviews where there is a sense of precariousness of not the same kind of network and support that women might have. The patterns are sort of slightly distinct for younger women as compared to older women. And then the question really is about how do we study this negotiation that women make in terms of aspirations and potential disappointments and failures that they might experience. And in this, what has come out through the interviews and the case study is that the familial strategies, so while my macro was at the individual level, there's an important recognition that strategies of social mobility are negotiated at the level of the family. So people like Anirudh Krishna, for instance, have written substantively on this idea of the family as very important. And so in my interviews as well, the support that these women had from parents, especially in terms of gaining access to education, came from across socioeconomic classes, and the kinds of strategies that they employed in terms of at least ensuring that status is retained and not lost. So one is, when we think of social mobility, we tend to think of social mobility as just upward or downward. But actually, sometimes stability is better than downward mobility. And so these negotiations that families make are more or less being done in a way to, if not possible to be upwardly mobile, to at least retain what one person has at the level that they have. And so we need to understand these familial strategies of support, but these are differently patterned by gender within a family. And so for instance, in one of the interviews, the young woman that I was speaking to, she was encouraged very much by her parents to study, to do an MBA, to keep studying. And so she thought that this was very equal. Her brother was encouraged and she was encouraged. However, the reasons for the encouragement in terms of further education was that the parents told her that there was no possibility for her to inherit the family business, whereas the brother would inherit the family business. So education for her then was the strategy to gain something in the labor market, which the brother would not need to have that high level of education. This mapped very well with the work Munshi and Rosenzweig have done in Mumbai on these familial decision-making practices that take place within communities. And so within this then, understanding what the limits of aspirations are is crucial, because it isn't that, as Appadurai says, there's a capacity to aspire, and not everyone has an equal capacity to aspire. And so sometimes there is a limit to these aspirations. Those limits can come from within the family, and those limits can come from within the labor market, of course, but they can also come from within the peer group that they belong to. So if one doesn't have a role model, then they don't, a positive role model, then they don't know that there is a possibility to aspire for something else. So I'll end my talk by talking about where this research is going in the future. I think a lot more work is needed to disaggregate these broader patterns and trends. My book does a part of it, but a more regional disaggregated analysis is needed over time, which is something I hope to work on. Further, understanding the narratives of women who are in the labor market, I think we need to also understand those who chose or could not enter the labor market. And that is the element that I'm interested in now focusing on much more, because there's possibility of how class is reproduced for the next generation. So like Henrika Donner studies in her work in Kolkata. Further, I have done some work on spatial mobility, but I think a lot more emphasis on the rural urban, and then within an urban city, spatially disaggregating mobility is necessary. And when we look at geographic mobility and not just intergenerational social mobility, the role of migration is crucial. As I said, I've done some work on migrant women in the city, but I think this is the way that I'm thinking of looking at space, residence, and movement as I go forward. And some of this work is already published. Some of this work is ongoing. The most recent work is on ambition that I've done. But my book and a previous chapter on education, the book is more macro patterns, and this chapter is much more qualitative interviews. So I'll end now. I think I'm ending on time, and I look forward to the questions and to the discussion and any suggestions people have, because this is ongoing work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your erudite lecture delivered in absolute methodological framework. It's a motivating lecture, particularly for youngsters, because see, remember that more than rhetoric for a researcher, methodological framework is of utmost importance. And this lecture exemplifies that. So, once again, thank you, madam, for your excellent lecture on uneven chances, gender, aspirations, and social mobility, covering intragenerational mobility. You gave the conceptual clarity on social mobility, the status approach, class-based approach, the mixed method approach, patterns and drivers of social mobility. Well, you all have attentively heard madam's lecture. So it's time for the questions, comments. Please interact meaningfully. Okay. So I welcome your questions, participants, RC8, and of course the guests. You're welcome with your questions. Please interact meaningfully. Yes.
Hello.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yes,
Please
Mr.
speak.
Ramesh. Mr. Ramesh.
Hello. I'm Dr. Rajkumar.
Dr.
Hello.
Rajkumar.
Congratulations, Dr. Divya, madam.
Yes, Doctor.
Yes. You did very wonderful work on this topic. I'm really appreciating, and I'm giving my wishes also. And I hope that you will do more and more in methodology. You did a lot of work on that. And at the same time, my wish is if you are masterizing the methodology with the data analysis, you should apply the SPSS program on your methodology. It's very, very useful to understand even by the common researchers. Anyhow, may God bless you. It's a very nice talk, and I am enjoyed your talk. And maybe many of the researchers have a lot of inspiration because of your presentation. God bless you, Divya.
Thank you. I do use SPSS and LEM. Those are the programs that I use for the analysis. But thank you. Thank you.
I am a faculty in Andhra University teaching research methods and statistics. So that your presentation is very nice. But if you are applying the SPSS, because the modern social science research is badly need of SPSS program. If the in the SPSS model, like a t-test, chi-square, and f-test. That is very, very useful to the research.
Right.
Anyhow, God bless you.
Thank you. All right. Shall I answer as we go, or shall we take a few questions? The chat.
Yeah, you may answer, ma'am.
All right, all right. So in this talk today, I didn't, as you would have noticed, I didn't really focus on caste so much because that requires a very distinct kind of a focus. What I have done previously is look at the intersection of caste and class and whether the association between caste and class is weakening or strengthening, and whether that varies by rural or urban areas, and where we do find a weakening of the caste class association, however, and that's weakening at the more extremes, whereas in the middle we see a kind of a persistence of these patterns, and that, as you rightly say, has an impact on the social mobility opportunities, not just for women in rural India but also in urban. Now, in terms of that's in terms of the macro. In terms of interviews, I did not speak to women in rural India at all. Or in any rural area. And so I'm only really able to talk in terms of the urban. And very interestingly and significantly, in the interviews, very seldom did they bring up caste as a factor. Whereas tangentially, they might have spoken about caste and location as tied to occupation. In the conversation itself, it was much, as driven by them, was much more focused on education as a possible avenue, not disregarding that there are differences, clearly differences by caste. So I hope that answers what you were asking. I think Dr. Rajesh was asking something when he had unmuted himself. Yes.
There was an intermission meeting, so I thought, no, I'll ask my question.
Actually, your voice is very weak, so I can't hear you very well.
A bit loud. Rajesh, sir, please check your
Well,
microphone. We
Dr.
can't hear
Ramesh
you.
has already asked his question, madam. Any more questions, please? Suraj Berry? Yes, Suraj.
Suraj, please unmute
Yeah.
yourself.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Divya ma'am, for a very interesting presentation on social mobility. I wanted to ask, like in your study, did you also look at the dynamics of family structures in terms of its impact on social mobility experiences within the labor market? I mean, within the family structure, extended, joint, and nuclear, if that plays a role in different experiences of mobility. Second is the aspect of marriage, like whether there is also a data or field insight on how marriage is contributing to stability or social mobility of these groups. So
Yeah.
if you can just
Sure. Thanks, Suraj. So, in terms of the first question, which is on dynamics of family structure, yes. In the interviews, in particular, there is a clear pattern of those who live alone and those who live with an extended family in terms of what the scope of physical movement is, which also then influences the kinds of jobs that they are able to get. I mean, there's not enough time for me to go into the details of it, but there were several cases of women who spoke about how the family structure influenced them. So some of the migrants said that coming into Delhi and then being in a nuclear structure helped them a little more to be able to negotiate the city a little bit more. But family was also seen as a support mechanism. So it was both in terms of both of those. In terms of marriage, I have a chapter in the book which looks at marriage mobility. So not just mobility through occupation, but mobility through marriage. And so there is some data both in the NES, which is on spouses' occupations, which allows one to look at whether there's more mobility through marriage or through occupation. So there is some information, yes, on marriage, which is possible. I think in the chat box, I can see a few questions. So the first one is about scholarships that affect mobility. Yes, I think this is a very important one. There are people like Ashwani Deshpande, etc., who've studied these within the National Election Survey data, which I use. There is no information on whether the person had reservation or ever used reservation. So it's not possible to do this at the macro level, but there are parallel studies of people who have looked at reservations in particular. The second question is by Asta, how aspirations are being conceptualized. Um, yeah, so it's both, Asta. So it would be in terms of both in terms of defining what aspirations are, because going into an interview, I would need to know what I think of in terms of aspiration. I'm not going to directly ask them a question on aspirations, but I will ask them indirectly, conceptualizing aspiration and breaking it down into its indicators. So asking them about what do they want to do, what did they want to do before, the limits on what they've done, and then through the interviews also conceptualizing as I went what they spoke about in terms, especially I wasn't expecting to see things so much in terms of regret or failure. And so being able to have a more nuanced understanding of aspiration was crucial. And the Junaid asked a question about religious aspect regarding this, specifically for Muslim women. Junaid, there is, so this book on marginalities and mobilities amongst India's Muslims has a chapter specifically looking at these patterns of social mobility by religion. And in those in that we find that yes, there is a very specific, not just in terms of social mobility, but also occupational division in terms of the kinds of occupations done varies, and that in turn that then influences social mobility very much. So yes, there is. Dr. Rajesh says, in the context of media influence, how much has digitization contributed to urban mobility? I don't have a direct answer to you for this, because this isn't something that I was able to focus so much on given the kinds of data that I have. But I would imagine that there is the possibility of jobs themselves potentially changes and then the people who can gain access to those jobs potentially also changes. So there is I'm sure this is an important area, but I don't myself have any data on this specifically. Divya asks, limit access, also digital infrastructure, affect gender equality in education. Yeah, so in terms of education and achievement in terms of education, there's increasing work that talks about inequalities which are perpetuated because of inequalities in access to technology and to digital spaces. And we all know, especially since we work in academia, that COVID kind of exemplified that moment where those inequalities was seen much more sharply. And so I'm sure because of these factors, there's potentially an impact also in areas, not just rural areas, but also urban areas where there is lower digital penetration. So I'm sure that would make a difference. I think those are all the typed questions, and there's one raised hand.
Yes, Dr. PVL Ramana, ma'am.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm PVL Ramana from ICFI Foundation of Higher Education from Hyderabad. This is really very interesting study you have presented. And only one simple question I would like to ask you. You have interviewed young women professionals and analyzed it. It is actually motivating for senior women professionals also. In your continuation, you are doing a lot of research and you are continuing your research. Do you think you can concentrate on senior women professionals? I, being a senior professional, I felt your study is very interesting, and I congratulate you for your excellent work. And I look forward for further research from you, which will motivate our senior professionals also. Thank you, ma'am. Excellent lecture.
Thank you. I think there's you're absolutely right. There's much more scope to expand this and to look at women across. I think this was more targeted because there was a project that I was working on that looked at young women especially, and I was looking at transitions into the labor market. But you're absolutely right. I think more consistent work on women across age would be very useful. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Just one more question I wanted to ask.
Could you shed
Towards the
light
end
on
of
this English medium and access to opportunities? You cited an instance of English medium, English education.
So yes. So I mean, what is the question? I didn't catch the question. There was a difference in terms of English language education.
Yes, madam. English
Mm,
medium, and access
mm,
to opportunities.
mm, mm.
Yeah, could you
Yes,
shed light?
yes. So I think in the interviews, in the in-depth interviews, there was very interestingly women who had lower levels of education and had not necessarily done a BA or postgraduate were more likely to say that education was important. But those who had slightly higher levels of education were more likely to say that education is not sufficient or schooling is not sufficient, but education within English, because it opens up the avenues to a broader kind of a scope within the labor market, both in the formal and in the informal sector. So they were more likely to highlight that. Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you, ma'am.
Suraj has one question, I think. Suraj?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Vaid, towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned about aspirations and the role of hard work from the qualitative part of your study. Is there also some empirical data about the role that's positive motivational philosophy that is very central for middle classes? So be positive and you can do it and all that kind of. How does it contribute to the aspiration part?
Yeah,
Does it
yeah.
have any?
As you know, many people have written about how crucial, I mean, the values, what middle class values are, and how middle class itself is an aspirational class. So we see some of that in these interviews. We see this, but it's a lot more in terms of there is a with that motivation there is a fear. The fear is we should not be downwardly mobile. So it's more about maintenance of a particular structure, at least a particular position, while aspiring as much as possible to move up. So yeah, I mean, this is how I mean, they use language which is about motivation. Yes, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there is a question in the chat, if you can answer that, please.
There is a question uh, on mobility and women empowerment and how much they are related to each other. Um, Yes, so it isn't a direct relationship that because women are mobile, they are more empowered. But through my interviews, I could see that just gaining access to a job, being the earner. So I remember one of the women, she was a seamstress, said that just being able to earn and bring money to the family meant that she had more power within the family to negotiate. Now we know that's not necessarily consistent across all families, but these were cases in which just having and for her it was also having education, minimal education, since she was one of the few people in her family who was literate, was something that gave her an important decision making position within the family. I think there's a raised hand by Professor Vivek
Vivek,
Kumar, Dr.
yeah, please. Please unmute yourself.
Good evening, ma'am. This is
Sorry,
Vivek.
sir.
Congratulations on all your work in the discipline. I wanted to ask that how social mobility, specifically in urban areas, if we see that women, they are more socially conditioned. So how that social conditioning or the cultural traits, these deter women or they promote women in some ways in social mobility, in overall stratification.
What do you mean by social conditioning? That they are not conditioned to be in the labor market, or what is this social conditioning?
And social conditioning of working, going outside to work to gain that high level education or
Yeah.
skills to work
Yeah.
outside. That's what I meant.
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly, the women do talk about how there are barriers, and the barriers that they have are not necessarily barriers that are because the job, the job created barriers, but barriers that one of the women I spoke to, I remember, said that just going out at night is a problem, and so while the men in the family can do these BPO jobs which go overnight, she's not able to do so. So there are certain things that hold there are certain structural things that hold them back, and then there are certain decisions they themselves make. So yes, I guess I don't know if that's social conditioning, but that's definitely the social factors. I mean, factors of the family and their situation that makes a difference. Yes. There are some other questions in the chat box. Uh, Government schemes from women, how we tell if these initiatives are creating real lasting change, especially from those from rural marginalized. Um, right. I mean, this is a very important question, but this is clearly beyond the scope of what I spoke about today. We have a network, a social mobility network of which I'm a part, in which some of these questions on whether initiatives make a difference and the intersection between research policy and practice is something we discuss. So you might want to check out that network and the kinds of data that we are trying to kind of put out. But this is important because whether these policies in effect bring about change, they will bring about change in smaller, or the expectation is in smaller stages. I'm losing my voice. First, it would be in terms of maybe access, in terms of education, in terms of possibility. But these will be constrained, as you yourself rightly mentioned, by other things like location, social location. So you might want to see some of this other work that people are doing. Um, how do we see it impacting rise of gig economy? Yeah, this is an interesting question about whether there is so in the interviews, I didn't have so many women who were, for instance, I've seen that there are women who might work as delivery agents or with as transport agents, etc., or who work on gig platforms. I didn't have as many in my interview, so maybe this is an area to look at a little bit more. But there is possibility of just this physical access and space, and that makes a difference to whether women are able to do certain jobs or not able to do certain jobs. And finally, mm, yeah, and disability is a very important element. And it's not an element, honestly, in the broader social mobility work. There's much less work on disability, though increasingly the recognition that within stratification, disability should be one of those categories. And so it would, in effect, and disability can be something that affects right at the initial stages, but disability can also happen in the job itself. And so at various stages, it's expected, at least the literature that exists on this says that it is expected to play a major role. And so in a work that it's not directly on disability, but in a work on health and illness, people like Anirudh Krishna have spoken about how these illnesses, or and I'm because I said there's no work on disability, and I'm not equating disability with illness, but Anirudh Krishna talks about illnesses, and he says families then strategize differently. And so one can only hypothesize that if we studied disability, because there might be certain jobs where there is an absence of access, and then there might be jobs where there is a possibility of access depending on what the nature of the disability is, but there is no work. And so honestly, there is very little work on this in relation to social mobility. There is work on health, as I said, on illness, but not on disability. There's very little work on genders broadly. There is much less work. So there are areas within social mobility, there's very little work. Whether major things required for restructuring, yeah, potentially one would need to, I'm not sure if it's the restructuring of the education system, but it's also possibility of skill-based education, possibility of looking at what the opportunities are in the job. So a match needs to be there between education and what is possible in the labor market, and mismatch would lead to a bigger kind of a problem. Yeah, and so and you're right. So there isn't much participation in the gig economy. I agree. And so there's anyway, I have no data on that in my study. But I've got some very good ideas from the questions that you've been asking. I think these are very important and valuable questions to keep in mind. So thank you.
So, shall we conclude the session? Dr. Supriya Singh?
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was
So,
really
on
very enlightening
behalf
lecture.
of RC8,
Yeah.
myself being the convener, Dr. Supriya Singh, the co-convener, we first of all profoundly thank ISS President Professor Maitri Chaudhary for introducing Dr. Divya Vaid ma'am to our RC8. Ma'am, we are immensely benefited by your lecture, particularly the young researchers, to how to bring a topic into a methodological framework and discuss it scientifically. So, and you have also very patiently answered the questions. So we are very delighted by your lecture, and we look forward to future interactions with you, particularly students of research scholars of South India, particularly of Andhra University. And on behalf of all the RC members and guests, we profoundly thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.